Most of the research that I'm going to present today has been conducted in collaboration with this team of colleagues, and it's been a great opportunity to collaborate with so many people. The basic premise of my talk is that the effects of drought on large and intermediate sized river ecosystems, and I'm going to entirely talk about the Colorado River system. But the effects of drought on those ecosystems and on reservoir ecosystems is not solely dependent on the effects of reduced watershed runoff. They are dependent on how society responds to managing reduced runoff. And that is the premise of my talk. The Bureau of Reclamation has estimated what would the flow of the Colorado River be at Lee's Ferry at the head of the Grand Canyon, which is as good as any place to estimate the total runoff of the river system. What would that flow have been in the absence of any human diversions? And you can see a running average line, but we now generally divide the history of runoff and streamflow in the Colorado River into three parts. An unusually wet period that we call the early 20th century pluvial period, when mean annual flow of the river was nearly 18 million acre feet a year. A long period in the mid and late 20th century. And then since 2000, this period we call the Millennium Drought that Dr. Tarbotton will talk about more specifically later today. The important point is that during the Millennium Drought, natural runoff of the Colorado River system, what water gets into the system, has been about 12.4 million acre feet a year. And I apologize for using such an atrocious unit in a university. So the question you might ask is, well, one thing I would say is that early 20th century pluvial period is the period when the first agreements to manage the river were negotiated, the Colorado River Compact and the Boulder Canyon Project Act. When the river had a hell of a lot more water in it. But is 12.4 a big number or a small number? If you look at all of the data for consumptive uses and losses estimated by the Bureau of Reclamation, all of these data are available. They're all federal government data. I've only shown two significant digits because there are behind the scenes challenge or debates about what the precision of these numbers are, especially related to agricultural use of water. But if you add up the consumptive uses by each basin, each of the states, these are consumptive uses not including reservoir evaporation in any state or the Lake Powell or what have you. I've reserved that to a separate number. And you add these up for the upper basin and the lower basin and what we deliver to Mexico and what we lose in evaporation out of the lower basin reservoirs, the total of those numbers is 15. And 15 is more than 12.4. And that is the point. The system is fully tapped out. So you might ask, how is it possible? And these are average values for every year of the 21st century. 15 is greater than 12.4. How is it possible to sustain 15 greater than 12.4? And the answer is you drain the storage. You spend everything out of the bank account. And this is the combined storage. This is the storage history of Lake Mead. This is the storage history of Lake Powell. Together, you can see that we essentially have evaporated the storage out of the system. Now, I want to talk about the implications of river ecosystems and follow on the lead of the previous speaker. The first point I want to make is that when we talk about the interaction of society dealing with drought, we want to distinguish a couple different impacts. First is the raw impact of withdrawing water from rivers. That is an impact. And secondly, when we talk about the dams and the diversion structures that affect river ecosystems, we want to distinguish between the effects of the sheer existence of those features. Lake Hoover Dam fragmented the river. There's no fish that's going to make it from the lower river into Grand Canyon past Hoover Dam. But we want to distinguish that from reservoir operations, the decisions that are made on how to operate the river. So keep that in mind. How much water you take out, the existence of the structures, how you operate them. Now, what I've done here is for some key gauging stations. In red is the average hydrology of those rivers in the early 20th century pluvial period when the first parts of the law of the river were negotiated. And the range in shading is simply the interquartile range. 50% of the flows occurred in that shaded area. And in blue is those same rivers today, the average of 20 years of data of the 21st century. And what you can see is that for the Green River at Green River, Utah, the Upper Colorado River at Cisco, Utah, you can see that at least the snowmelt pulse is maintained. But you can see that the interquartile range of the flows today don't even overlap the interquartile range of the flows of the early 20th century. Look at the San Juan River. The San Juan River is an emasculated image of its former self. Now, these are the impacts of a warming climate and reduced runoff and the effects of withdrawals of water. If you look at the hydrology through Grand Canyon, then it's a whole different deal. The river doesn't look anything like what it once did. This is the effect of reservoir operations and producing hydropower at the time that electricity is in most demand. And then the sum of everything is this far left-hand lower corner comparison of the hydrology at Yuma. That is the river that is truly no more. There is no river and there is no water that makes it to the sea. So when we talk about the future of the Colorado River and its ecosystems, it's important for us to be geographically precise. The Colorado River, in my view, can be divided into 4 parts. The Delta, there's no water at all. The lower river, a mixture of a fragmented river by dams, a channelized system, and ever-decreasing flow. Grand Canyon, trapped between the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States and wholly determined by the vagaries of operations of Lake Powell and hydroelectricity production. And then the upper basin, the most natural part of the river system. Let's look a little more in more detail at the Utah part of the basin, the Green River. We can dispense with looking at the numbers. The numbers are simply the annual flow of these rivers at key gauging stations in million acre feet per year in the 21st century. But what I want to highlight to you is the shading of the colors of these boxes. In blue are gauging stations where the annual flow at these gauges is 70% or larger of the estimated mean annual flow in the mid-20th century. Now, we've had climate change, so we have less water, but you can see that the White River still's in blue, the Yampa River, largely undeveloped, is in blue, the upper Green River coming out of Wyoming is in blue, and a couple small gauging stations, as is the headwater runoff in the San Rafael. But the lower downstream gauges on the Duchesne River and the lower San Rafael River have less than 50% of what the water they once had in the middle of the 20th century. And that's not climate change. As an illustration, this is the Duchesne River at Mighton, Utah, in the middle of the Uinta Basin. And in red is the early 20th century flow of that river. The Duchesne River was a real river. It got to 3,000 to 5,000 CFS each year in its floods. Today is in blue. It's not a river at all. That's not climate change. And Casey Pennock, Phaedra Booty, myself, and others published a paper pointing out this simple fact and pointing out that the least depleted rivers in the upper basin have the best native fish populations. But it's not just flow, it's river temperature, as Frank Howe told us. But in the main stem rivers, it's about river temperature controlled by the temperature of reservoir releases. Because reservoirs thermally stratify in the summer. And when the withdrawal points are low and the reservoirs are relatively full, we release relatively cool water downstream. And the shading here are the thermal regimes of summer in sort of an average water storage year. It's a thermally altered river, but it's a river in which new novel ecosystems have now developed. And as reservoir storage declines and the reservoirs get lower, then the withdrawal point, in this case for Lake Powell, begins to withdraw water out of the warm epilimnion. That's changing the thermal regime of the downstream reservoir, of the downstream rivers. And when we link projections of water storage in Lake Powell to river temperature models, we project what the temperature of releases will be. And if we look at the most likely scenarios in the next 2 years, either the minimal or the most probable projections of future runoff, we're looking at temperatures that are unprecedented in the 50-year history of Lake Powell, and now are returning to summer temperatures of the pre-dam river, a completely different regime. So what will the future of the Colorado River and its thermal regimes be? Well, with a team led by Kevin Wheeler, we've used reclamation's models of system operation and consumptive use to project reservoir storage. And in this case, the vertical axis is the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the combined storage. And the dashed line is dead pool. And the variation in the shading is simply that looking at multiple different hydrologic scenarios that Dr. Tarbotten will explain this afternoon, there's different outcomes. We don't have a perfect view of the future, but the point is that if we operate the system under the rules in place, the lower basin uses as much as it's ever used, the upper basin continues to grow. If the present regime is the new normal, we tank the system. We tank the system and the temperatures go sky high. Alternatively, as another end member, if we reduce lower basin uses, if we overall reduce expenditures out of this declining checking account, we can stabilize the system with more water stored in the system. That would produce a very different, a very different environmental outcome. Now, what would it, in this scenario, this is a scenario we call parity. Parity would mean that the upper basin continues to grow with its future hopes and dreams, and lower basin use is dropped greatly. I can assure you that our last speaker this morning, Chuck Cullum, if he achieves this reduction in water use in the lower basin, he will get a large annual bonus in his job of directing the Upper Colorado River Commission. But the point is, there are ways to do it, but it's societal response. And so our team in the Future of the Colorado River Project has looked at combinations of reducing upper basin growth, reducing lower basin use, and then shown different outcomes for what the river might be, what total reservoir storage might be. And the way to look at this is lower numbers here mean warmer releases and different environmental outcomes. And so let's just say that different colors and different parts of this simply represent different possible ways to manage the system, which mean different thermal outcomes for the river depending on where you store water, in which reservoir, and how much you use. But there's a wrinkle. Are those warmer temperatures like the old days good or bad? The dam system now is filled with non-native fish. Trout in the tailwaters of these reservoirs, reservoir warm water fish that get swept downstream into the main stem and eat and compete and interact with the native fish. And predicting these outcomes is a huge, complicated problem. Drawn down reservoirs create impassable waterfalls and rapids at the inflows to these reservoirs because the rivers don't downcut in the same place they once were. And these are impassable barriers to fish. Is that good or bad? Depends. And to further complicate this, at the same time we talk about Lake Powell in crisis, a drawn down Lake Powell reemerges some of the hidden wonders of Lower Cataract Canyon and Glen Canyon. And there are stakeholders who celebrate the demise of Lake Powell and see it not as a reservoir in crisis, but a river in restoration. So there are lots of different potential outcomes, good, bad, and this is going to demand a new kind of river ecosystem science to inform decision makers of what these outcomes of changing reservoir storage might be. And the most important thing is not for ecologists and river scientists to declare that some change in condition is going to recur to result in a different ecosystem. Difference doesn't help policy decisions. We need to tell decision makers whether there will be irreversible threshold changes in river ecosystems from which the systems can never recover, because then we might get some traction in communicating with policymakers. But are these changes good or bad, even if we predict the ecosystem outcomes? It depends on what we want. And what we don't have is clear visions for what we want for these four parts of the river system. Right now, we just manage the river as a working river. We just do what we want for water supply and hydroelectricity, and the only environmental value we really care about is we don't want any threatened and endangered species to blink out. That's the only thing that really matters to a major policy decision maker. But we could, in fact, manage some parts of the upper river to have healthy, dynamic, native ecosystems. One problem with that is that it often leads fish biologists to call for unusual flows just because they benefit a species. An alternative is to have as an objective what I call the natural flow regime river, a river that might have more non-native fish, but has a spring snowmelt flood. And look and the feel of the edges of the river and the riparian zones are very much like what they were. Well, we can debate this. Now is not the time. I would just say that this is the great debate that we must have in this country if we are going to inform and help water supply decision makers. We've got to decide what we want. And just, and the approach of using what we call desired future conditions in places like Grand Canyon doesn't get us there, because it's a zillion little niche issues that are partly incompatible with each other. It doesn't guide us. So in conclusion, this is a session about decline in watershed runoff. That's what we call drought. As Patrick reminded us, let's never forget, drought is caused by climate change. That's caused by management of the atmosphere and the global climate. But then everything that ripples down from there is this interaction between social and political science and river ecosystem science and engineering. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And the outcome is what we want for water supply, what we want for hydroelectricity, and what we want for river ecosystems. Thanks.